thank you all. Thank you for the invitation to speak tonight. I wanted to speak about the broader Middle East, and I will touch on Israel and Palestine in a second, but I wanted to start off by giving a couple of rather curious quotes that just came to mind as I was preparing this little talk. As the revolutions in the Arab world were starting off in January, Egypt, Tunisia, etc., there was an interesting quote in the Wall Street Journal. A US official, my favourite term, which I'll come back to in a minute, told the journalists from that paper that they weren't looking for regime change as much as regime alteration. That was their quote, not mine. And the reason I think it's important we understand what regime alteration means, as we just heard about Egypt, is that in much of the Arab world at the moment, Egypt, Tunisia and many other countries, there has been profound change. However, in many of these countries, in fact all these countries, there has only been regime alteration thus far. Leaders have fallen, certainly, and there is a process undergoing in Egypt and elsewhere to try and find some kind of democratic change, and hopefully that is successful. But we shouldn't underestimate, as we heard a minute ago, what exactly is going on over there. And the reason I think it's important for us to say that is that all these revolutions have happened despite what the West was trying, not because of it. Despite what us, not us in this room, I'm presuming, but us as Western powers wanted to maintain. The status quo suits a lot of people, and Israel particularly, which I'll come back to in a moment. One of the interesting things about what's happened in the last few months has been the way in which Israel particularly has been affected. And on the one hand, this I think needs to be addressed in a few different ways. Let me address them one by one. The first thing which has been fascinating is how the Israeli government under Netanyahu, the Prime Minister, has framed Israel's future role, potential future role, after these regimes around Israel are changing. Ehud Barak, the Defence Minister, who was also Prime Minister about 10 years ago, was in New York a few months ago giving a few speeches, and he made a couple of interesting comments. He spoke to an IDF fundraiser, and those guys need a lot more money, clearly. And he was talking about, and I haven't got the direct quote in front of me here, but I remember it quite well. He says, Israel is an island of stability in a dangerous neighbourhood. And this is in some ways a phrase, in fact, that Israel's been using since 1948. And in some ways, and in many ways, has been incredibly successful to guarantee much Western support. So the idea that you have numerous Arab regimes which are, in inverted commas, unstable, although arguably much of the Arab world has been very stable because we've been back in dictatorships for 30, 40, 50, 60 years, is that Israel is more reliable because it's, in inverted commas, democratic. And what he was asking for and demanding from the US was namely more money and more arms and more weapons. And it became very clear, in fact, that very soon after the Mubarak regime fell, I should say Mubarak himself rather than the regime, the US Congress did decide to give Israel far more weaponry to maintain, in inverted commas, a qualitative military edge, which is the term that Israel has always demanded they must have against their regional neighbours and so-called enemies. And this became very clear late last year when the US Congress talked about selling $60 billion worth of arms to Saudi Arabia, that lovely democracy in the Middle East. And Israel was a bit upset about that, concerned that their qualitative military edge would be challenged. And the US Congress said, no, don't worry. And Obama said, no, don't worry. We're selling you guys the better stuff. Don't worry. We're selling them good stuff. To Israel, much better stuff. Much more deadly stuff. And we laugh, but the truth is that one realises very clearly, and I don't think this room needs to be convinced of this, but Obama in this region has been an unmitigated disaster. A disaster. And he's been a disaster for two reasons. One, because much of the left, or should I say some on the left, not all, in the US, particularly during the last election campaign, not surprisingly wanted to not have a Republican president who could have been John McCain or Sarah Palin, which would not have been ideal, I grant you that. But the way in which Obama was fated and the expectations put upon him to do certain things in a range of areas has led us to a situation now for two things. One, in much of the US, and there are notable exceptions, I grant you that, but in much of the US, the so-called left, so-called progressive movements, whatever, often have been paralysed to an extent. And you have not seen mass protests and outrage over many of the policies that has been continued from Bush. if one looks at a lot of the key issues in US foreign policy towards the Middle East, rendition, torture, Guantanamo Bay, occupation of Palestine, increased occupation of Afghanistan, maintaining the occupation of Iraq, increased drone attacks in Pakistan, I could go on, supporting Yemen, Egypt, I could go on. Ultimately, that has only continued. Now, yes, in the last few months there have been some shifts in the Middle East because of people power, not because the US has assisted that. It's been the opposite of that. And in fact, one realises that when one sees what the US and many Western countries wanted to happen in Egypt, if there was such a mass movement to unseat Mubarak, which there apparently clearly there was, the aim of the West was to simply replace him with an equally pliable figure, Suleiman, the man that you mentioned before, who has been identified by Mamdouh Habib, as all of you will know, an Australian citizen who was tortured in Guantanamo Bay and Egypt. Suleiman himself has been identified as one of the torturers of Habib, and he told me this myself, and he's written about it himself publicly, Habib has. And he's currently, Habib, through Egyptian human rights and lawyers in Egypt, pursuing a legal case against Suleiman and others who were complicit in human rights abuses, including torture. And one of the things that became clear was the Americans, and indeed the Australian government too, were pushing for Suleiman to replace Mubarak. You simply replace one thug with another. And the WikiLeaks cables that emerged about this issue, which came out in about January, February, revealed a few things. One, there was literally a direct line from Israel to Suleiman's office in the past years. And Suleiman himself was key and central and vital to maintaining the siege on Gaza, which often we forget this when we talk about a siege. It was maintained and remains being maintained by Israel and Egypt. It's not just an Israeli issue, it's an Egyptian issue. And the Egyptian new regime, quasi-military establishment have said that the Gaza border will open in the next couple of weeks. Let's wait and see if that actually happens. There's been talk about it, there's been questions about it. I'm sceptical if it's going to happen because Egypt is clearly wanting to maintain the $1 to $3 billion of aid they receive from the US annually, which is mostly arms and military support, which you'd have to say would be under question if the border towards Gaza is opened. One of the things that also became so clear looking at the relationship between Israel towards the Arab world is, and I've said this for a number of months, and I think it's a statement really of fact rather than opinion, for Israel to maintain its position in that region, to maintain an occupation and anti-democratic norms, it can only do that with dictatorships around it. Arab dictatorships, client states. You cannot maintain the infrastructure of apartheid that exists in Israel, let alone in Palestine, unless you have pliant states around you. Now, obviously the role of America is key, the role of EU is key, the role obviously of Australia is less key but not unimportant. But to have states like Egypt and Jordan and Saudi Arabia, all in various degrees of friendship with Israel, that allows you to give the impression of friendship. But in fact, is essentially the West paying those guys to maintain friendship with you. The only reason the Mubarak regime and the regime Abdullah in Jordan are friends with Israel is because they're getting paid by the US for the friendship. So I can get paid to be friends with people too. If you pay me, I'll be friends with anyone. But ultimately, it's about saying, how do you maintain friendship? And that's why that when the US and Israel was so petrified of the Mubarak regime falling, one of the few leaders who came out right at the end saying publicly, Mubarak's a good guy, he needs to stay, was Israel. Saudi Arabia said it too, but they would. Was Israel. And I think it's important, although most people in this room probably take this as a statement of fact anyway, but it's important that we understand what that says about the Israeli democracy, I use that term very advisedly, compared to states in its neighbourhood. And one of the things that's become very clear and hopeful in a way is the possibility of things changing in Palestine itself because of what's happening around the region. Now,